Good day. How are you? My name is Ken Allen. I'm a potential candidate for the full-time instructor position at COM. And part of that interview process involves me giving about a 20-minute lecture. And there were several topics to choose from. I wanted the one that had the most meat to it, the most intriguing aspects, just basically to wow you and have fun with and keep me interested. But I also wanted something that, I'm going to need to study a little bit and learn about. And so I chose fire behavior and combustion mainly because there's some fun stuff in there like backdraft, excuse me, and flashover. And that's what the main 20-minute lecture is going to be about when I give my presentation on Monday. But for now, I decided that I wanted to, as I was researching and getting this all together, I wanted to know more. I wanted to get down to the fundamentals again and go through this and kind of see what I knew. And when I got to a subject that, like Newtonian thermodynamics, for example, which is part of fire behavior and combustion, I wanted to know more. And so I actually found myself digging deeper and deeper and deeper as I'm making these slides and saying, well, now what exactly, how does matter, energy, and movement all work together? As far as energy, with everything I'm going to get to now, and coming across some like really intriguing bits that were wowing me and blowing my socks off. And so I decided rather than try and cram all of this together in 20 minutes and give it to people that are, of different knowledge levels for fire science, why don't I make a big, full, comprehensive lecture, really getting the meat of some of these matters, find the stuff that gets me excited, kind of go back to basics for myself, create something that is a longer version of it, about an hour or ideally less, depending on how long I wax on here. And then from there, I'll distill it down to something really fun and smooth for the presentation at school tomorrow, so that people there aren't getting bogged down in academia, and people that are there are getting enough. They're whetting their appetite for the how cool this stuff actually is and how interesting it could be, so that if they do find it intriguing and interesting and they want to know more, they're a bit curious, they can come to this site, they can download this video or just watch it on YouTube and get a little bit more for their dollar for free. So without any further ado, we should probably begin here. So if you have any questions or anything, and obviously you won't see this until after I give the presentation, but you can put it on this page. Apparently, I haven't done too much on this YouTube page, so I'm new to it. I'm happy to learn it as I work with everyone out there. So by all means, make comments and get me a little bit more educated on this part. I know that tech is an inevitable portion of how we're going to educate in the future and everything else. So anyway, this is another whole situation where that's an opportunity that can be exploited. Okay, so now to start, share screen. There we go. Okay, so we are going to share screen now. And without any further ado, let's begin. Wait a minute. Let's go back. Fire behavior and combustion. Okay. Okay, you got to go away. There we are. Okay. Fire behavior and combustion. And this is me down here. If you have any questions, let me know. So what are we going to learn today? Well, we're going to essentially figure out these topics. What is fire? Scientifically, what are the basic components of fire? What are smoke, flame, and heat in an academic sense? And it's important when we get to things like flashover and backdraft. What are the stages of burning? What are specifically flashover and backdraft? And what are the signs of backdraft and flashover? And that's going to be the fun part tomorrow, I can guarantee it, or on Monday, rather. Why is this stuff important, though? Well, if you're working in the fire industry, you can never have too much training. And so this ideally will keep you and your crew alive during a fire. If you've happened into a situation where these are potential threats to you, you better know what you're looking for so that you can keep yourself and your crew and the public alive. I think it also promotes proper reverence for fire. It's a natural disaster. And so anything that's big enough that it can create its own weather system is something we should pay attention to. So even if you don't work in fire, you are still at its mercy in some situations. So it's best to know your enemy, right? It's also your friend. I mean, basically, fire, energy transfer, thermodynamics are all the fundamental underpinnings of modern civilization. Everything that we have created here was extrapolated from our ability in the most existential sense by harnessing fire, the capability of doing that, and everything that stemmed from that ability. Like a Prometheus situation. It comes for better or worse with a lot of potential and danger. And it's up to us to figure out how to best use that. And at the end of this, you're going to be a little bit smarter. And I feel like every day we should just try and be a little bit smarter. You know what you think? So fire and really energy transference or the movement of energy is everywhere. It is ubiquitous to modern civilization. And it started, I mean, think about it. We had the courage to build this fire and take this fire and hone it when we knew probably the first time we were introduced to fire was something like that, burning down the hillsides of our lands where we were roaming and hunter gatherers if you subscribe to that belief. And so with that fire, with taking that bit of fire from the chaos and from the carnage of it, we were able to build forges, to build ore and extrapolate ore. We can build tools, taking that fire, eventually going from the Iron Age, the Copper Age, the Bronze Age, moving into the Industrial Revolution. Steam power, which it revolutionized our society. It's essentially just steam burning water over a fire and powering the movement of that steam as it leaves. That simple knowledge allows us to create steam engines that can travel all over land across our continents. It was one of the giant steps in the American story to get the transcontinental railroad across it, as well as Britain getting through India and Africa and so forth. It powers our steamships. It was the fundamental reason why in the early 20th century we colonized the Philippines in order to have coal stations all in the Pacific to move our fleets, our steam powered ship military fleets across the Pacific. And I mean, the other thing that takes into consideration is we needed those islands in World War II as well for the use of airplane hangars and airports. And so everything you just saw there is essentially, sorry, let's go back, what we have built from the internal combustion engine. Look at this. It's an electrical, it's a spark in this case, but it is electrically driven fire. It allowed for the engine, it allowed for the radial engine for propeller planes, and eventually the jet engine here. And that gets us, if we haven't gotten across sea and land, it gets us across air. It allows us to move our military across I mean, however you feel about it, this is how we have employed ourselves and how we act in geopolitics today. That same radial engine became a jet engine, becomes a ramjet in this case. This is how the B-2 bomber works. It forces air into the intake to move that plane around. Fire and energy and the movement of it is literally how nuclear energy was devised. And now we live in fear and need to essentially grow up if we think we're going to stay on this earth. With electrical energy, we're able to power microchips. We're able to create our computers and our cell phones and the thermal imaging cameras that we use when we're fighting fires. All of this started when we learned how to harness that flame. And so it's important. We should get into what fire is. So fire, or I'm going to call it combustion throughout this lecture, is a rapid chemical reaction. The reaction causes heat and energy transfer. And so when we talk about energy, We'll get into it in a minute, but energy and matter, in many ways, if we're talking about it through Newtonian thermodynamics, are interchangeable. Essentially, matter is potential energy. And so, what we're seeing with fire or combustion is matter turning into different matter and giving off energy in the form of heat and light. If you are looking at a fire, it can also be called deflagration or the process of something burning. It's a rapid combustion or rapid oxidation, slower than the speed of sound as compared to detonation, which is that same occurring at a faster speed, faster than the speed of sound. So in that case, something that's exploding, it's basically a fire that is happening so fast that it is moving faster than the speed of sound. And we need that if we are trying to get some things taken care of. Let's say we're trying to build tunnels for our trains. Well, you're going to need to detonate some holes in order to get it through. So, okay, so the flame and smoke. What are flame and what is smoke? And if we are looking at this, the area of combustion here that is relatively hot, where we are seeing light, is the flame. And you can see here, it's like a yellow orange. As we move closer into it, it becomes kind of a white or a white blue, which you'll see in a minute. But this is important to pay attention to smoke, because smoke is fuel. It's unburned fuel. It is essentially the matter that was in whatever was burning, the organic matter, but the fire wasn't ideal enough. It either wasn't hot enough, it wasn't carbureted enough with an equal amount of oxygen and fuel, and so it didn't burn all of the fuel. So that smoke that you see leaving is potential fuel that was never used because that fire is not burning efficient enough. Now, that's going to be important when we get into backdrafts and flashovers, because that will ignite. Also, the color of smoke. There are entire classes that you can get into that talk about reading smoke. And what you can, I'll give you basically from what I know, the darker the smoke, the denser the fuel that's in there. The lighter the smoke, it's spaced out, and it was usually due to a better burning um, state. It was burning better, and less was wasted, and therefore it's less getting in the air, and that looks white. When it compacts down in dark, it's thick and it's rich, and it can burn if it gets hot enough. So if you were to look down here, there's something called the non-luminous zone, and you can see that on candles, where just at the base of the wick, it's kind of dark and there's no flame going on, and that usually is followed by some kind of blue cone that sits in there, and that should be pointing at the other one. So it's the hottest part of the flame. You can't really see it there, but you can definitely see it here on these torches. And the reason you can see it on these torches is because down here you can actually dial in the amount of oxygen that's going into the torch, along with the acetylene or the propane or whatever you're using. And so you're getting the cleanest burn by dialing that in. So this is a nice, hot, tight cone. You can see there's another one here. This would kind of be, this would be the equivalent of the yellow orange, this one here. And this is your hottest part. This is where they're putting the spot to burn. It goes right in that spot because this is the hottest part of the flame. All right. So we're talking about burning, and I mentioned that we're using gases, but we can also use organic compounds like wood and let's just leave it at wood so that we're not macabre. But what's it take to burn? Well, you need four things. Initially, they thought three, but then those three create a fourth. So we need oxygen, heat, fuel, and we need sustained chemical reaction. So you need the oxygen, the heat, and fuel to be mixed and beginning a chemical reaction, and then you need that chemical reaction to be maintained. So initially we called it the fire triangle. Now it's called the fire tetrahedron. Essentially, you have heat, fuel, and oxygen on all of those. Imagine on the back, the oxygen's there, plus the chemical reaction is the floor. Think of it like that. So all three of those are pyramided together, and then there's a base to it, and that's what allows this to continue burning. So let's talk about those ingredients to fire. Again, if you have any questions, please send them to me. I'd be happy to answer them. So the first one, oxygen. It's obviously abundant in the atmosphere. It's about 21% where we are right now, 20.9, 21% at sea level. As you go on higher altitudes, the oxygen content, along with the atmosphere itself, becomes less and less and less. And that's why the Olympic training centers in Colorado, where there's less oxygen in the air and it's harder for any person to exercise, and there's some really cool things. If this were an EMT course, I could get into the idea that your body then produces more hemoglobin so that it can carry around more oxygen or what little there is in the air and so forth. But all you need to know is that the oxygen levels do matter. I mentioned with the acetylene torches that you want to be able to dial in an optimum amount of oxygen and fuel mixture so that it burns as clean as you can. And what the oxygen does is it acts as a catalyst for this chain reaction called combustion, or also called oxidation. So oxidation occurs whenever oxygen touches the surface of certain chemicals and certain substances. Rust is an example of oxidation, or patina on copper, that kind of idea, except for burning, it's rapid oxidation. We're adding heat to the oxygen and the fuel. And that is because of the reactivity of that certain fuel and the oxygen and the heat. It's a much more rapid oxidation. So here's an example of oxidation. It's a non-flammable one, but you can see once oxygen touches the inside of that mushroom, it turns it black. Here's another example. That's because the oxygen molecules are just touching the inside surface, or I'm sorry, the outside surface. So you notice that it doesn't go blue throughout the entire mushroom, just in the spot where the oxygen touches. Does that make sense? So that's the area of reactivity that will be burning, is that outer surface where the solid is touching oxygen. And then we add heat to that. The rate of combustion is affected by the amount of oxygen present, as I mentioned. Well, that's going to be important when we're talking about backdraft, because backdraft is a situation where oxygen has been starved from that fire, and some bad things can happen when that oxygen is reintroduced. So heat, let's get into heat. This is where we get a little bit kooky, we get a little bit scientific. Newton's first law of thermodynamics. Bet you didn't think you'd be thinking about this today. Okay. What it says, it's called the law of conservation of energy. It says energy can't be created or destroyed. What it does is it transfers from matter to energy, or energy to matter. And so all of these things are equivalent. It just means that as we look at a system, energy is either being drawn into that reaction or that system, or energy is being released out of that system or that reaction, depending on what different parts of matter are coming together, and if energy is, what energy is required for that reaction. So the old thing was the apple falls down to the tree. Well, the thought is that apple has potential energy sitting at the tree, and then it falls down, and you have lost potential energy due to gravity and due to the flow of that apple falling through air molecules, so that it can't do the exact same thing and pop back up. That has already lost energy. Now, it wasn't destroyed. It was just transferred into kinetic energy. How much of this we have to know? All right. Well, what you have to understand is that energy and matter will basically interrelate through this situation. And so when we're watching something burn, we're having matter changing its form into less matter and more energy. So when matter combines with other matter, in this case, when you have, okay, not even that one, let's not worry about that. When matter changes states, when a piece of wood turns into carbon ash and water, what was in there holding those bonds together is released as energy. In the case of something like this, might kind of throw you a little bit, but if you have a block of ice and you melt it, well, that took energy. You had to put energy into that ice to melt it into a liquid. So that's considered an endothermic reaction, meaning that the molecules in there actually had to absorb some of that heat energy in order to melt and break their bonds. That's endothermic. Whereas with an exothermic reaction, from a piece of wood to turn it into ash, you will have to release a tremendous amount of energy. And that energy comes out in the form of light and heat. And as that's occurring, what's basically going on in that surface, take these little red balls bouncing around as the electrons on the outside surface of the stick or wood. As they're being freed and they're being released through that fire, they begin to speed up and bounce around. And they're literally bouncing between each other. That bouncing and that rubbing between each other is basically friction. And that friction is causing heat. And the movement of these molecules around is releasing heat and energy. And we see that in the form of heat and light. Those are those little guys bouncing around. Once that happens, we can do what we will with those escaping molecules. And so take a coil stove here, and we're heating up this pot with the coils. So with the coils touching the bottom of the pot and the pot handle being attached to it, we're creating conduction, energy transfer directly from the coil to the pot, from the pot to the handle. That's heat transfer in the form of conduction. Convection we can have inside the pot, where the water, as it heats up, pulls the water molecules from the bottom up through the top of the water, causing it to go up, and then as it cools to come back down, causing these ripple or these circular movements around in the pot. Same thing happens on Earth with air molecules. We call it the Coriolis effect. The air's moving up, it's then getting cold and coming back down. And then the last one we're going to talk about, second to last, is radiation. This is radiant heat, the way that heat can basically, as we stand by the fire, we put our hands out or turn around and get our bottoms like toasty up by the fire. That heat we're getting is radiant heat. The heat from the sun that we feel on our faces is radiant heat. There's no direct contact other than the actual the wavelengths or the photons that are hitting us that are warming us up. And of course, as I mentioned, the molecules are essentially causing a friction. And as we know that, striking a match across a strike plate is lighting the magnesium, which then the friction causes heat that lights the magnesium, that lights the wood. Similarly, if you're starting a fire without a match, you need to have some pretty strong frictive capabilities, like the stick inside the little hole. As long as you have enough tinder down below and you do it long enough and the stick is dry enough, you got yourself a fire. Okay, so this is as mathematically in depth as we're going to get. So have heart, stick to it. We'll get through this, and then we're going to start getting a little bit more intriguing. So most exothermic reactions, in the case of fire is exothermic. They're releasing energy, as I mentioned, in the form of light. So we would use these for our lights, our lanterns and things in the old days, and in the form of heat. Of course, that's the fire around the campfire or wherever we're going to use that in our fireplaces at home. And so what's happening is, if you can take this chemical, whatever it is over here on the left side, if you add in a little bit of heat to get it started, just to start that chain reaction, we have that chain reaction ending at, or the beginning, I should say, at the end of the right side of the dotted line. Then the fire takes over burns, releases all of that energy, and then it ends up leaving you with the byproducts. Here's another example of it where you have, in this case, we have a hydrocarbon, which is usually an organic compound with carbon and hydrogen. It can have other things as well. In this case, we have methane mixing with oxygen molecules, adding some heat, and you create carbon dioxide and water, but you also get an abundance of heat as well. You get more heat let out or released than you've put into the equation, hence why it's an exothermic reaction. You end up getting more heat produced instead of what you've added into it. You also get more light into that situation. So yes, you need to initially add something to get the fire started, but what you're doing is you're breaking down two compounds, or a methane is more complex than what your end products are. So in the process of breaking those bonds on the methane, you make two much more simpler compounds. And because they're simpler, they don't have as many bonds between them. What happened to the energy that was holding those molecules together, those bonds? It was released in heat and light. There's your hydrocarbon. Okay, let's get into something a little bit more tangible. So we know about fuel. Essentially, we're talking about solids. This is a block of magnesium. Liquids, here's gas, good old gasoline, and ironically, gasoline. And then here's gas. And in this case, remember that when either solids or liquids burn, it's actually because there's a thin layer of gas on their surface that's wicking and burning. So we'll talk about how that happens. You can see here, these are matter, states of matter changing, solids. Ice goes to melting, and you can see the chemical bonding is different in each situation. You can see those bonds in the form of a hexagon in the cube. Over here, you just have the water molecules loosely linked. They're not all tightly linked. We've lost some of that energy going into a liquid form. And then, of course, when you evaporate it, you add more heat to it, and it evaporates in the form of steam or vapor. And at the top of the sky, where it's cooler, everything cools down, and that gas begins to condense and form clouds. And eventually it becomes so dense that it changes back into water and comes down, and you got rain, and then rain, it gets cold, and so forth. So you have always something either gaining, or you have something losing energy and gets cold, or you have something giving off energy and it gets hot. Endothermic and exothermic. Enough? One last thing to keep in mind with your fuel, you want it to have, if you want a rapid burn, the more surface area you have, the faster this is going to burn, because basically the more molecules are spread out across that stick. So if I were to take a log, and we'll show that in a minute, and of course, it's going to make it burn more rapidly. So here's a log here. This is a Presto log, so it doesn't super count, but you know that it's going to take a long time for me to sit with a lighter on the corner of that log and get it lit. And then the only reason that works with a Presto log is that it's impregnated with a bunch of chemicals that light up. They have a lower fuel limit they have a lower flash and flame point. So it would take me a long time, if at all, to take a lighter to a log and get it burning. Whereas if I were to take that log, cut it into a bunch of sticks, open up the interior of it and create more surface area that could mingle with oxygen and build up a pattern in such a way that oxygen had access to all of those different surface areas, you get what we have here on the right. You have a really quick kindling burn, which then you can place a log on top of. So you take these different surface area pieces and you can do what's called laddering. And we'll talk about that in just a minute, that way that you can take a very small, broad, thin surface with a lot of surface area, crumple it up in like paper, and then you can add wood. To that wood, you can add more wood. And then eventually, I mean, that's how we melt metal, right? So here's now we've talked about all three of these things: surface area, Sorry about that. Surface area, we've talked about fuel, oxygen, and heat, where the last thing we're getting into is this chain reaction that has to be allowed to move forward. So essentially, the idea is this. The reason we break these fuels into those three components or these four components is if you took one of those components away, the fire would starve and die, or the fire would go out. We can't have fire unless we have fuel, heat, and oxygen reacting in a chain reaction. So right here, we have that match, that beginning match lighting, creating heat for the match around it to heat up and also ignite, creating more in the proximal area to also ignite, forming this chain reaction. The initial heat, that initial match at the corner that lit, was just enough to light the proximal match to heat the one beyond that, and so forth, all the way down the line. So the initial heat and fuel released is enough to continue the combustion reaction. And typically this goes until there's no more fuel left. Again, this is called fuel laddering, the way that something small with a little energy can cause something great to occur. And this might be what some people consider the butterfly effect. Butterfly effect is a little bit more random, but essentially it's that idea that something small does have ripple effects on down the line, and something small that burns when it gets very hot can light something else that, if that is that can light something else that has a higher temperature and so forth and move down the line. So we can see this in wildland firefighting, where you have a small brush or reed that catches, and maybe it lights some tumbleweed, which lights manzanita, which lights a shrub or brush of manzanita, that lights an oak tree, that lights a whole copse of trees, which then runs up the hillside. And eventually you have what we've had for the last 2 summers in California, where last 3 summers. This summer wasn't too bad. Anyway, I'm just time stamping this for you to know that this is all put together within the week. So you have what we had in the last 2 years or 3 years ago, and the year before, the year after that, where we had to bring in people from all over the world basically to fight the fires that were going from California into Nevada and Arizona and everything else. It's because of this laddering effect. So, okay. One last thing that I'll talk about with surface area, and that idea that you have to really burn only the gas layer between the solid or the liquids, is that matter burns once it becomes a gas. If it's liquids, it's not the liquid that's actually burning, because that's a very dense matter state. What's burning is the evaporating or the vaporizing top surface layer of the liquid that is mixing with the oxygen. So that is basically evaporization or vaporization or evaporation. Vaporization is kind of, what kind of heat are we adding to it? Because some substances you don't have to even add heat to. It's already in room temperature. That's enough heat for it to be a gas. Okay, so pyrolysis is the idea that for solids, we also have to have the same thing. Solids have to still emit a thin layer of their atoms into the atmosphere so that they can mix with oxygen at an optimum ratio, have enough surface area. When combined with heat, it will ignite and start that chain reaction. So that, for us with solids, we call it pyrolysis. And we use pyrolysis for a couple of things today. This is fire burning tires. This is a tire pyrolyzing unit. They are using these, I believe this is in China, but they have this also in the Netherlands. They're working on this in Scandinavia and some places in Europe, where we're back to the same idea of burning trash. Only it's not what everyone is terrified about doing now, which, don't burn gas, don't burn trash. It's going to cause greenhouse gases to emit, and you're going to destroy our ozone layer. With these containment units, these pyrolyzing units, it gets so hot and so pressurized inside there that essentially we're vaporizing these tires with the extreme heat and pressure. And as they vaporize, we're burning off that vapor. So there will be almost 0% of smoke that's emitted. There will be 0% of unburnt fuel that comes out of these pyrolyzing units. So the idea is if we don't want to keep burying or leaving our trash everywhere, we can burn it, provided that we're using technology to our advantage and we're burning up as absolutely much as we can. Here you see a couple things to keep in mind. There's something called a flash point, which is the temperature at which a liquid gives off sufficient vapors to form an ignitable mixture in the air. This is sometimes when you go over and you touch a match to your stovetop and it goes out. You've hit a flash point, but you didn't get the chemical reaction started. Or maybe what happens is you add some, it burns, and then the energy drops out, and you have to build up more heat. You have to give it more heat to get to the fire point. And that's the temperature at which a liquid gives off sufficient vapors to burn continuously after ignition for at least 5 seconds. So here you see, again, you're not burning the fluid at the bottom of the pan. You're just burning that microscopically thin gaseous layer that's between the air outside and the liquid down below. And it's obviously there's a little mixture area there, and that's where this is congregating and burning. And I would assume this goes longer than 5 seconds. Unfortunately, the GIF only goes about 3 seconds. So, but that looks like it's burning pretty well, and I'll call it good there. Okay. Onward to the stages of fire. You can take a break here if you feel like it. We can come back to it. But at this point, I'm going to plow bravely forward. Come back to it if you need a hand. Okay. There are basically 3 stages that we have created in terms of fire. The initial one is the building phase. It's called the incipient or the growth stage. This is as fire first ignites and the chemical reaction process begins. The temperature in that area begins to build. The building temperature is then going to ignite more fuels, and then it's going to get hotter. And the hotter it gets, the more fuels it can burn. And so ideally, as firefighters, these 2 places are the worlds we want to live in. Thanks to modern response, we are making it to a lot more incipient stage fires because we can get a call to 911, who can then dispatch us, and we can navigate and locate where the home is much better than we could 60, 70 years ago. And so we can get there and stop this fire in its incipient stage before it becomes fully involved. So it's when sufficient heat, fuel, and oxygen come together to create sustained combustion. And the development depends upon the amount of fuel, the type of fuel, and the way that fuel is configured. And essentially, think about a room and how you have a carpet with a coffee table on top and a couch. And this is a very large, wide room with just a throw rug in the middle and a coffee table, and that rug lights on fire, but you have 30 feet in all directions. Chances are it's going to get to the end of that rug and there's no ladder fuels for it to continue on down. If it's a tight room with all of those things packed together with a Christmas tree in the corner, you're in big trouble because that incipient stage is going to be much more rapid. It's going to burn through that thing without any real restraint because fuel is so densely packed. Then onward to the fully developed or the free burning stage. And this is when at the peak of combustion, when you get all of these things cooking and roiling together, and you start pyrolyzing all of the nearby furniture and so forth, the chain reaction suddenly takes over, and you see this thing called flashover. Flashover is one of the most dangerous things that you face as a firefighter in firefighting. So we're going to get into that in a minute. But what's happening essentially is you're creating heat and you're burning and building smoke up, and it's getting hotter and hotter and hotter. And suddenly there's a moment of a fulcrum or a paradigm shift when the heat suddenly can ignite every available fuel in that room. And you will see it by the change. The smoke essentially ignites. Couches across the room light up through extensive radiant heat. And if you're in that room, you're in big trouble. More on that in a minute. So, what basically happens once you hit this fully developed stage is now everything in the room will burn unless we are able to dump tremendous amounts of fire, of water, or do something to it. But otherwise, if left unattended, basically the fire chain reaction is an all out mad dash until all of the components or one of the components is exhausted, and that typically is fuel. Careful of that. Flashover, not good. Okay, so that burns, and we finally exhaust the fuel, and then we get into what's called the decay stage of fire. It's when the fire fuel has completely burnt up, the fire diminishes, the fire decreases in intensity, all the fuel is gone. Fire now is either smoldering or non-existent. You can kind of see it right there. You know, that's just that flickering flame and ash. This is unfortunately another part of firefighting that's the unglorious, begrudging part that we have to deal with, which is salvage and overhaul. And this is when uh, our grueling time as a firefighter begins. You go in now and you begin pulling off walls, sheet rock, ceiling, and start trying to trace down where the fire began, if the fire has jumped into different stud bays, and essentially assure that there's no more fire activity in that house or with that structure, whatever it happens to be. This could take hours. I've done it for hours. I've done it for 3 hours. And of course, those hours are like 1 to 4 in the morning. And so it's grueling. You're exhausted, you're wet and soaking from the hose line. You've just been, the hose never seals properly. So you're wet and it's dripping on you and you're pulling powdered, charred ceiling on you. And then there's, the insulation gets on you and it's all, it's the, what do you call it? It's like fiberglass and you're itchy and sweaty. And of course you're sooty all over. Your clothes weigh like 10 pounds more. Um, Not great. But again, this is why firefighting, you get paid well, because that's the nuts and bolts of it, people. So be aware of that. It's not it's not all for guts and glory. This is the hard part of it. What was I going to say? Oh yeah, it's either you're freezing cold. At least this is out in San Jose. You're either freezing cold, shivering, doing this, or you're burning up and you can't take off your gear and everything else. Thing to remember is that there, in modern lightweight construction, there's a lot of polymers, a lot of plastics, a lot of chemicals and so-called fire retardants that are, aside from very hot and fast burning, they're outright carcinogens. They're outright cancer causing agents. And so you better be wearing all that gear to stay isolated from that outside environment. This gets into a whole other topic on firefighter safety and cancer awareness and everything else. But keep that in mind. Wear your gear, work hard, play hard. Onward, we're rounding third, flash over and backdraft. Okay, good. All right. So you will have had a lot of this on the lecture. But let's get into it. Let's have some fun with this. Flashover. This basically, it's the transition point, as I mentioned, between that incipient stage and the free burning stage. It's when that room suddenly simultaneously pyrolyzes and everything whoomp, lights up. This is thermally driven. This is due to, as the temperature rises, it will eventually do this if it's uncontrolled. So thermally driven with when every combustible basically rapidly and simultaneously ignites. This happens around 900 to 1100 Fahrenheit. And then here's a picture. Believe me, I'm gonna give you a lot. Don't worry. Here's a before picture. This is a containment. This is a model unit that they built to show flashover. So as you can see, we're in the incipient stage here. Fire is licking the ground. You can see there's a couch in there, and there's a decent amount of black smoke. I don't know if I would call this charged at this point, but note the smoke, note the darkness in there, and then flashover occurs. Okay. See the difference? See, now fire has crawled to the opening, and fire is now burning the unburnt smoke. Suddenly it got hot enough to ignite even the smoke coming out of it. All right. Here's another better example. There are a ton of Christmas prop flashover models that have been used for research and educational purposes. And you can see there, this room is now reaching flashover. And I don't know if you can tell at the bottom there, you can see the degrees going up, and it goes from 1.5 to 15, 16, 18, 2000, 2100, 2200. It is skyrocketing temperatures. I'm sure that the thermometer is above on the ceiling. Nevertheless, it's hot in there. Take this one over here. Pay attention to the see as that smoke is leaving the threshold. It's igniting. It's caught and it's now burning. Same thing over here. This thing, literally, the flames will walk across the entire ceiling. They call that rolling flames, or another name is dancing angels. You want to watch out for black smoke. Look at that. All right. Thick black smoke, charged. It's pumping out the windows. It's not wisping. Like, imagine someone smoking a cigarette and you see that little wisp of smoke coming out. Not like this. Dark, black, thick smoke charging out windows. There's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of heat in there. These dancing angels here. You remember anybody? All right, I'm going to put it in. So there's a book called Watership Down, and it's about these rabbits that have to leave their warren in search of a safe place. I saw it as a kid, and there's a book, but there's a movie, and it's a pretty traumatizing story. I don't know how many of the newer generation has seen Watership Down, but there's a thing called thorn, which is like if you were to see a snake rise up in front of you and you were a mouse, that petrified fear and awe of seeing that is what stops you from getting away. And the snake kind of counts on that. So it bears up and shows you its unflinching, unblinking eyes and its shape, and then just, hiya, they get you, right? I feel that way about dancing angels, that you see this beautiful phenomenon happening and you know what it is, but you're almost paralyzed to get out. Like, you go, oh my God, that's like, and then you're waiting for the boom to get you. But don't get, so I guess the idea here is don't get thorn with the dancing angels. It's called dancing angels for a reason. They're calling for you. So get out of there. And then the last thing you will feel if you happen to be caught inside these flashovers is sudden excruciating temperature rise, like on your ears, suddenly blistering and burning. And get low and get out. Grab the hose line, reach back and walk your way out of that room. By all means, get out of that room immediately. Here's another video of flashover. And it's a real quick one, so we're not going to get caught in too much. Now, you can see this room has been kind of built for flashover. There's a lot of light, flashy fuels, and there's probably a bunch of like kerosene in the pallets and everything. But watch. Hot, hot, hot. It's going to start to spread across the floor. Now watch this thing. Okay, now it's starting to burn. Watch. Boom! There you go. Flashover right there. That's our moment of burn. Now they're going to run in and put it out from the outside. Look at that. It would walk all the way. That fire would then carry through to this hallway, and that black smoke would then burn too. So you think anybody's alive inside that building? I can guarantee you nobody's alive inside that room where flashover occurred. Okay, backdraft. Now, rather than a heat-dependent phenomenon, this is an oxygen-dependent phenomenon, or rather a lack of oxygen causes backdraft. Essentially, what happens is you have combustion occurring, you have the chain reaction of oxygen, fuel, and heat. And then within that moment, for some reason, the oxygen is used up and there's no continued supply of oxygen. So the fire gets choked out or gets snuffed out. This usually happens because you're in a contained room or shed or something where you can't draw in any oxygen. So what happens is the heat remains, the fuel is in suspended animation, ready, but there's no oxygen to burn. So it sits and it sits and it sits, and the speed of combustion is slowed. But then, as I mentioned, there's ample heat and fuel. So when oxygen is suddenly added, boom! Oh, dude. Okay. So, boom. Now that is down as a backdraft. That is an insane backdraft, if that is what it is. It could be, though, if that were the kitchen or if that were that back parlor there. What's happening is oxygen is being introduced by a door or a window, or someone broke out a back slider or something. Air rapidly rushes in, and suddenly it mixes with the available smoke and heat, and you get this giant reaction. This here would be an example of that detonation, that we have the deflagration, conflagration, and a detonation. This is a fire burning faster than the speed of sound, and that's why you get a sound like that. That's why you get an explosion. So here again is a backdraft prop that somebody built. And what they're doing is they heat that up. They heat up a room. They have enough oxygen in it and fuel and heat it up, and then close the door and let that stew for a little bit. And then when they reintroduce oxygen, everything spreads out. We gain surface area across that smoke, and suddenly, boom, everything mixes and it explodes. So what are you looking for? Well, highly charged smoke. Can you see highly charged smoke there? For sure. And about that, you see it going from black smoke to a gray, white, or even a yellowish color as it wisps out. Usually it's in a tightly contained room. It's closed up. For some reason, it heated up, it burned in there, but there's no more draw of oxygen. And so hence it's caught ready to burn when the introduction of oxygen occurs. So it's tight and contained in there. And what you may see is if there are small cracks in the windows or in the eaves, you'll see this wisping or puffing of smoke as the pressure builds in there and it like forces it through the cracks. You get these little wisps of hot charged yellow, white, or gray smoke. Here's another good example, and pay attention to the color. You'll see it go from a dark black to a gray white, followed by, well, watch when he opens it up, and boom. You can almost hear that sound, right? That's what's happening. They have probably a door on the back end there, or this might have been just open and it took a minute for the oxygen to get in, and then once it made it in, it's like drinking out of a 2-liter bottle. You suck and then let go, and that air bubble goes into the bottle. That same kind of idea here is it's puffing, 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 and then it stops puffing and pulls in some oxygen. It mixes somewhere in there, and then boom. Okay, hope that was good for you. I have a couple other videos that I'll put on, and then we'll call it a day. So final thoughts. Well, we've put in the groundwork right now. This is all what I'm talking about. This is a relearning, or maybe an initial learning for some of you, of the fundamental knowledge about what fire is, how fire works, how we define different stages in fire, if you can even call them that. I mean, those are man-made stages, but they help us to perform firefighting more efficiently and more safely, is as safe as you can get. So the idea is you lay the groundwork before you put the boots on the ground. These places are very dangerous, and we need to have vital information as we go into fires and emergency chaotic scenes. And fire is essentially chaos. It's entropy. So it's essential that we do the groundwork and study this stuff for our safety and for our crew, and especially for the public. It's as I mentioned, it's not safe. This job is, if you're looking for a safe job, go, not bad, not try Google or YouTube. Um, you're going into a place where death is always on the line. So I don't know how safe you think it's going to be, but if you have the courage to do it and you want to, we need you. There's constant stress and threat of death on the fire ground. And what that means is you need to know what you're doing thoroughly before you get into more stress and more threat of death. On every single fire, you learn something. Every fire I went on, I tried something new. I saw something new. I thought about something differently. I had a little mix up on something and went, right. My advice for you is get out of here and get to a busy department and go to the busiest stations in the busiest places all over the Bay Area or all over the world, because the more fires you see, the better you get not desensitized, probably that's the term, but it at least brings down your stress level enough that you can analyze things. And so you have to remember, even the simulation fires that we go on, there's nothing simulated about a fire. I can do it for training, but the fire doesn't know it's a simulated fire. It doesn't know it's a simulated emergency. Fire is fire is fire. And start your Rolodex of info now. Start getting all this information together, because in the end, you are responsible for everybody's safety. I don't know how many times I can say that. And so, what I was going to say was that they've found with therapy, with stress and trauma therapy, what they do is they introduce people to the stressful things that they're afraid of. And the initial thought was, we'll continue to show them these things over and over and over again. They'll get less afraid. Well, that's not exactly what happens. You show them these things and you acclimate them to their trauma and their stress and their phobias. And they don't get less afraid. They still have the same fear reaction, but they become more courageous to confront it. It's a very different thing. So keep that in mind. We should be going towards these emergencies. You should want to be in these situations more, and learning and understanding, and then building on your training with that information. Remember, on the fire grounds, if you're doing this, you see those things, charged smoke, you see power lines down, et cetera, et cetera. But in this case, if you see backdraft and flashover potential, say something, and say something to the crew that you're with. You can always, say, hey, is that what they call an example of charged smoke? Is that what it looks supposed to look like? And, maybe they go, hey, Cap, the pro we just saw, what do you think of that smoke? That looks pretty charged to me. What do you think? And then, the captain can make the decision. You can make the best decision for the crew and the people if they're inside, and so forth. So remember that everybody's voice is legit and it's valid, and you should voice your opinion, not in an opinionated way, but just, this is what I see. How does that factor into the equation type thing? Because these situations are, as I keep saying, very stressful. Your first couple of fires, your first dozen fires, um, really more than that, even. You're racing to that call. The sirens are going. You're putting on your clothes in the back. You come around the corner and you see all this billowing smoke down the road, and you pull up. Smoke and flames are coming out of the windows. They're saying there's people inside, and there's outside. The citizens are screaming. You're getting out and just doing your best not to trip down the steps of the engine. Like, are you going to be able to do the job in spite of all of this stuff? The better you are, the more acclimated you are with the terror and the chaos, the more you can deal with that and then focus on the job that needs to get done. What do you see on that fire? Do you see that kind of smoke? Where do you see smoke? What's that house look like? What would be the best way to get into that house and put out the fire without pushing the fire through the rest of the building, with doing the least amount of damage to that house? You'll have learned. All right. So essentially, will you have learned the fundamentals adequately enough to know what's going on in this situation, or to the best of your knowledge, and know what to do? Can you be calm enough to read the situation and see the hazards and remember the protocols and save the lives? Basically, can you do the job? Are you willing to put in the effort to train like we did today? And I thank you for joining me. It's really about your willingness to learn and go back and relearn, and taking those fundamentals and bootstrapping off them over and over again. And I want to ask you the question: did you learn anything today? What did you learn? Thanks very much. There we go. So that's that. That's today. And you'll have a much more condensed, or I should say, distilled version of it. Do you have any questions? Whoop, drop them on this thing, and we'll talk to you yourself soon. And boy, I sure hope I get this job. Take care, and be careful, be brave.